All right. Hey, thanks, Liz, and hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. Do appreciate it. We're really excited today to talk to you about the cmi5 progress that we've made. Not we in particular, the Rustici team, as a part of a award from ADL to get this great work done. Can you go to the next slide, please? All right, great. So basically, who are we? Brian Miller is the Director of Engineering at Rustici Software. He's been involved with the cmi5 group pretty much since the beginning. He's an expert software engineer and has an expert xAPI user and developer. So it was awesome to be working with him on this project. George Vilches is a principal software engineer at Rustici Software. I've known George for almost as long as I've known Brian. He's been at other companies in the past, but he's also one of these guys that's been on the in the xAPI world since it was formed, really. So an awesome team and a surprising addition. He wasn't on the original roster when we had signed Rustici on, and what an awesome addition to have George. So looking forward to both of those guys presenting. Briefly, I'm Andy Johnson. I'm the Specs and Standards Manager at ADL, but we're not going to be getting too much into that aspect today. So if we can focus on the great work that these two have done. Go to the next slide, please. Great. So basically, as Liz said, there's going to be two parts that we're going to be tackling. Brian's going to talk about the cmi5 overview, Catapult overview, the prototype player that they developed, and the Lms Test, and then some questions and answers. And George is probably going to be supplementing that a little bit. And then part two is going to be talking about more of the test suite itself and the application of it using course templates that we developed. So if you remember the SCORM templates or the example courses, think of these as the same thing, but even better with kind of a better bridge ahead to the future, if you will. So I don't want to spoil either of those too much, but hopefully that's something that interests you. I'm sure it will. There's great aspects to all of the software that's been developed and what these guys are going to present. So with that, we can turn it over to Brian. So Brian, take it away, sir. Thanks.
So yeah, we're going to start out with just a general background on cmi5. I know a lot of people here will be familiar with it, at least in name. Hopefully a lot of you are already familiar with xAPI and the concept of xAPI. So we're going to skip over the xAPI parts today and focus just on this cmi5 component. So what is cmi5? cmi5 is an xAPI profile. So essentially a profile is an extra set of rules that you use cmi5 or use xAPI with. So if you're familiar with the xAPI statement concept, then a profile says when we want to capture a piece of data about an experience, we're going to capture that as a statement. And that statement needs to conform to some sort of specification itself. You know, what does it mean to capture the play statement about a video? Well, that's what a profile is intended to do. A profile says we know when we're experiencing a video that we're going to expect to see certain types of statements, maybe play, paused, ended, skipped. Those are the types of experience that we're having with a video, and so those are the types of data points that we're capturing. This kind of profile leads to plug and play interoperability between systems. So as a video piece of experience or piece of content is going to be played in an LMS system, that LMS system then can recognize the types of data that it should expect to see. So cmi5 itself has a very specific data model and a very specific information model. And it's designed specifically for when a learner launches the content. So when xAPI became a thing, we started capturing all of this wonderful data about new experiences or even existing experiences. What we've learned over the last decade or so is essentially that a large part of the training content that's still out there in the world that people still want to leverage comes from an LMS. It's been assigned by an administrator, and it has kind of some core components to it that need to be captured in all cases. So cmi5 really outlines this in using the 4 components that are listed on the screen. So we have the concept of a course package and a structure to that package. We have the learning management system. It's not something that can go away. We have the learning record store, which is the core component to using xAPI in any system. And then an assignable unit. And for those of you that come from more traditional or legacy e-learning platforms, you can take the word assignable unit and think of it as SCO in your mind. Assignable unit's actually a term that comes from the AICC world. So CMI5 in action. So we started out with that core component of a course package. So presumably an author of a learning content experience creates what we call a course package. And inside of that course package is a structure file. And that structure is telling the LMS about what content it should expect to have to launch. And then because of that LMS component, that's the link between this course content or this experience and the learners. And those are the users, the end users of the system. So we enroll a learner in a course, and then that course is expected to be played by the LMS. So the learner launches that course structure package and interacts with what we're calling the assignable unit. Again, that's the scope. So when that actually launches, the LMS is using the LRS via xAPI calls to kind of set up initialization data. And when that initialization data is ready to go, it records that that learner has launched that experience. So we get the first piece of the information model, and that is we have launched this experience. Once the learner starts to interact with that assignable unit, the assignable unit itself has to do various things when it starts up. So it's going to initialize itself. It's going to retrieve launch parameters from the LMS. It's going to retrieve certain concepts like mastery score data points that it needs to be able to run itself as the experience. And then as it progresses, as the learner progresses through the experience, they're going to store statements to the LRS. And those statements are either what we refer to as CMI5 defined statements. They're statements that are specified by the CMI5 specification itself, or they're allowed statements. And those statements are really any other xAPI statement that we can come up with. So for instance, you could leverage the video profile inside of the CMI5 session, and those would be CMI5 allowed statements. So when we talk about CMI5, we're really talking about what can we do beyond SCORM and beyond just xAPI. So CMI5 comes with certain additional capabilities. We already talked about it. It has a very structured launch capability. A lot of people don't realize that xAPI itself doesn't talk about package. It doesn't talk about launching. It doesn't talk about how you access authorization credentials to communicate to that LRS. So that's really what the launch capability is doing in CMI5. It's providing all of those elements that we still need in a traditional e-learning experience, but the xAPI doesn't provide directly in the specification. When we talk about a wider session structure, so again, xAPI does a very good job of outlining what a data model is. It provides a way to capture data about an experience, i.e. the statements. But what it doesn't provide is the information model. It doesn't tell us what statements to expect. It doesn't tell us how to mark the beginning of an experience and the end of an experience. So that's what the CMI5 session is doing. It's saying, we know that this learner has entered into an experience, a piece of content, an assignable unit when we see the launch statement followed by the initialized statement. And then we know at the LMS level, at the reporting tool level, that we shouldn't expect any more data about that session when we see the terminated statement at the end. So then along with those kind of session markers, those boundaries, we look for firmer profile control. So what we refer to as the big four. So these are concepts that we see in almost every piece of e-learning content. So we see completion, we see pass fail, we see a score, and then we see a time, a duration. How long did it take? Those pieces of the information model are provided by CMI5 in very strict terms. So we know exactly when we see a completed statement that it will be the only completed statement. When we see a passed statement, we won't expect there to be a failed after that. And those types of things are outlined in the specification. We have a few additional things that go along with that. Waiving. So in CMI5, it's possible to have a course structure that has multiple assignable units, in other words, multiple launchable pieces, and maybe we don't have to do all of those pieces. So if we've, our boss, our administrator has decided that we don't need to do the third AU, the LMS can set up a concept of waiving. So we can get credit for that assignable unit and get credit for the experience without actually having to go through it completely. And then finally, we see control of exit behavior. So I talked a little bit about the terminated statement. The other thing that we tend to see is we have what's called a return URL. In other words, what will the user see when they exit this content? When the content is exited, the return URL provides a way for that user to be taken back to presumably the LMS or a page that indicates a certificate or those types of things. And then one final piece about CMI5 content is that you can launch remote content. In other words, with SCORM, what we saw was that all of the content had to be packaged together. It had to exist inside of that file with the manifest file, etc. In this case, what we can see is the structure itself can point to remotely hosted AUs or assignable units. And so you could have a core structure file that is just a plain XML file, and it points to all assignable units that are hosted outside of where that LMS is. This gives a lot of control on the content side that we just didn't see in the past. So comparison of some key features. Again, we really looked at what are the gaps that we saw in SCORM from when it originally came out, back in 2000, the late 90s. What were the possibilities then versus what are the possibilities now? And obviously the big one is we want to be able to track anything. We want to be able to say, yes, we have a reporting system, and that reporting system can understand the semantics of this experience. We want the data to be portable. All of these things are things that we leverage via xAPI. But at the same time, we still recognize that there is a very big use case for I'm a learner, I have a learning management system, I need to launch some content, and I just need it to track. And so again, that's why CMI5 brings back to the table the concepts of launch, packaging, and information model, etc. So where have we been? Essentially, CMI5 is now about 6 years old, and that tends to be a surprise for a lot of people that aren't necessarily following along the weekly working group calls. So CMI5 itself released as the Quartz version back in 2016, and what we didn't see was a lot of adoption. And what we've learned in the intervening years is that the reason there hasn't been quite as much adoption is because there's just not the tooling around it. So to provide that kind of assistance or push for the working group and for the community, the ADL contracted to develop what we're calling Catapult. So this is a CMI5 advanced testing application and player that underpins the learning technologies. So it's been a 12-month project, and man, today is the last day. It's been quite a ride. And what we've developed is an open source CMI5 player prototype. So this is designed to provide you with the ability to launch CMI5 content, test it out, try it out, see what the specification is all about inside of your learning management system. And then a set of test suites that are intended to work for the next 2, 5, 10, 20 years. So these are the test suites that are needed to test content and LMS or platforms. Along with that, we've seen a big need for, hey, man, I just need some CMI5 course templates to get going. I need a push. I need to see, how hard is this? Is this a thing that works for me? So we've developed some course templates. If you're familiar with the SCORM world, then you've probably used the golf examples, and they've been out there for years and years and years. So we have some templates that are similar to those. And then a best practice guide and documentation for implementing these tools. So how do you go about procuring an LMS that has CMI5 support? What should you do when you're looking at an authoring tool or you're trying to buy a set of content? What do you need to do to make sure that you can procure the right thing so that you have interoperable systems? That's really what the Catapult project is all about. So where does CMI5 fit? Well, CMI5, again, kind of a horse that we're beating here, but it is a legacy system, SCORM, and then we have this whole concept of a total learning architecture, interoperable data, much better analytics, all of the things that the Experience API was intended to do and to promise. What the promise was, CMI5 is the bridge that can cover that gap. So it is, how do we go from legacy content launched by an LMS to new data points, to new analytics, and CMI5 is that package and launching structure. Catapult is the thing that we believe gets you from best practices and a good set of tools in the SCORM world to what is relatively new in the CMI5 space. So expected outcomes. Essentially, we're trying to eliminate a barrier to entry. What we saw in talking to LMS vendors, what we saw in talking to authoring tools vendors, is neither one of them wanted to move first. So authoring tools said, well, there aren't any LMSs out there in the industry that can play my content. So why should I support CMI5? And of course, then we talk to the LMS vendors and they say, oh, well, there's no CMI5 content in the world, so I don't need to be able to play that. So what we really need to do is eliminate that barrier by providing both sets of tools. We need to be able to provide sample content for LMSs to implement against, and we need to provide sample players for authoring tools that want to be on that forefront. They want to be the first out there in the world with CMI5 support. And so if they have those two pieces in place, both groups can hopefully move independently. But by leveraging the conformance test suites, we can know that once they get to market that they're going to be interoperable. So that's really where the concept of a conformance test suite comes in. You know, we need the ability to validate both the courseware and the platforms so that they can be developed independently. So to do this, we leverage some lessons we learned from SCORM. One of the things that SCORM did well was have test suites, have tooling around it, have sample courses. The test suites themselves were a little bit difficult to work with. So that was one of the things that we wanted to improve here. One of the things that we heard from our designated stakeholders was that we absolutely had to have the ability to run this in an automated fashion, and that it had to be executable by people who may not be as technically savvy or who may not have a developer background. So those are really some keys that we learned were necessary to make this actually work, and things that we wanted to improve on from the SCORM experience. So what did we come up with? We have an open source set of tools. All of these things are open source. They have the Apache 2 license, if you're familiar with software licenses. They are out on the ADL Net GitHub repository site right now. You can go to this link and find all of the tools. So on this slide, you can see kind of the home page here, and then at the bottom is the README for the repository, and it has a very quick, brief intro to each one of the tools. So I'm going to actually show that live repository right now. So we can see this is all of the source code at the top. Again, we can see that this is an Apache license, and it's hosted on ADL Net's organization on GitHub. Each one of the pieces, and there are a few ancillary things that go along with the site, as well as a documentation site. So I'm going to pull that up real quick as well. So this is a documentation site hosted on GitHub, again, through ADL's GitHub account. And we have user guides for the player, for the test suite, how to use the LMS test suite, and then some additional resources on this documentation site. So when we're talking about the first component here, the player prototype, core to being able to run CMI5 out in the wild is the ability to play the content. We have to have something that's going to ingest that course package. We're going to have something that's going to provide the launch URL to get into an assignable unit and to interface with the LRS. We have to have something that can provide authorization to an LRS and to do the kinds of things where we're making sure that the content itself is following along with the specification. And that's really what the player prototype is doing. So again, freely available, open source, and it sits in between essentially the LMS and works with that LMS to provide that CMI5 specification requirements. So it is intended for the system developers. This is intended for the LMSs. They want to build a minimally viable CMI5 implementation, importing content, and playing the experiences for the users. So what does this look like? This is a real simple architecture diagram. Essentially, we have an LMS, and it's using an HTTP request interface with the player. The player itself is a web service API. And then that player underneath the hood is communicating with a database, an LRS, and the local file system for content files. So I'm going to go back over here, and we're going to look at the documentation for the player web service. So for any of the developers in the group, again, this is a Swagger API. This is the documentation for that. and we can see that it provides pretty basic HTTP requests, such as posting a course. So that's how you would import, and we'll show examples of how to do these things in a more sophisticated tooling in the second half of this webinar. Then we have the concept of a registration. A registration is a key component to CMI5 itself. All of the information model that I talked about earlier lives underneath the concept of a registration from xAPI. And then we have some session management tools, and you can see that there are a few additional components here, like setting learner preferences, which is a concept in CMI5. I mentioned waiving AUs, and then the session itself can be abandoned. Those are the types of things that the player prototype needs to provide. The LMS uses these web service API hooks to implement the CMI5 specification. So then the next component is the LMS Test Suite. So after you've stood up the player, you want to make sure that it works. We want to make sure that your LMS has implemented CMI5 itself correctly. So the LMS Test Suite describes, the system that is launching the CMI5 content and what it must do to be CMI5 conformant. This system we refer to as essentially a CMI5 launching system rather than an LMS. You'll see in almost all cases it's represented as an LMS, but it doesn't have to be a traditional LMS. There's a lot of different variations on the way the industry talks about LMS these days, and this is really intended to make it possible to test all of those types of things. So what is the LTS itself? First, it's a set of packages. It is a catalog of assignable units. It is a catalog of course packages. That LMS has to be able to work with those course packages. So beyond that, I mentioned earlier that we wanted these tools to be automated. So this is a big deal for LMS vendors to be able to say, yes, I have added the test suites to my continuous integration. In other words, so every time I come out with a release, I should be able to run this test suite. So it's a command line interface, generally friendly to developers, that leverages the library of test packages to allow you to automate the testing of that LMS. The command line interface itself exposes an integration interface. So what does this mean? This means that within CMI5 specification, there aren't rules about how you must import a content or where you have to put the launch URL. Those rules are considered outside of the scope of CMI5. So because we can't know how your LMS implements the concept of import or launching, getting the launch URL, so then this ends up being an interface. So when you're implementing the LMS Test Suite in an automated fashion, you put in the information about how to do those things for your LMS. And that allows the LMS vendor some amount of control over how their testing is going to be set up. And then so finally, there's actually a manual test procedure. And this manual test procedure is for anyone that isn't the LMS vendor or someone who's procuring an LMS that may not be yet doing testing. They have the packaged library themselves, and they have the procedure document. They can actually go through and manually test this LMS just like they would have done back in the days of SCORM. And I can show that procedure document real quick. So in this is again in the GitHub repository under the LTS. So the LMS test manual test procedure. This is the thing that we would follow manually if we wanted to test an LMS in kind of a one-off capacity. So there's a couple of packages here at the top that we want to import. The LMS has to accept these packages, it has to allow them to be launched, it has to understand these types of packages. So one is a zip64 package, one is a package that has 1,000 assignable units, because those are hard requirements in the specification. Then there's a set of invalid packages. So these are packages that we would expect the LMS to reject. They should not be importable, they should not be playable. And then more importantly, really, and the part that hits most of the requirements of the specification is the runtime verification. So this is a set of packages that can be imported, and when they are played, when the AUs inside of them are launched, those AUs run automatically, and they test various requirements of the specification. And then once those AUs have run, if they've run successfully, then we can also do additional validation after that. In other words, an assignable unit has to send an initialized statement. So one of the checks that we have to make in there is, go look at the statements that are captured in the LRS and make sure there's an initialized statement. Make sure that it has the session ID in it. Make sure all of the parts of the specification are there. So when I scroll through this list, we can see that there's a lot of things that have to be checked manually. And each one of these is intended to kind of probe the LMS to make sure that it is meeting the specifications requirements. And then there are a couple of pieces to this that are actually optional. So the ability to manually abandon, in other words, force someone to be out of their session. And then the ability to waive is actually optional in the specification. But if you implement either manual abandonment or waiving, those have to be implemented against the requirements in the specification. In other words, you have to do them a certain way. So we want to make sure to test those when they are available. All right, so again, I kind of covered the LMS Test Suite. This is the architecture diagram. We can see that we have a test package library. I mentioned the LMS integration interface that is part of the command line tool. And then that is intended to, again, test an LMS claiming CMI5 support. I think I've hit my time. So now we're going to open it up for the first question and answer period. We have about, looks like 13 minutes for some questions, and I will try to answer those. Let's see. I have a question here from Bob. I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, so I'm going to leave it at that. Is suspend data still a thing? Can I retrieve data that persists between sessions? And is it erased on completion? So the answer is, looks like someone gave a quick answer about using xAPI documents. That is the suggested route. Yeah, so within CMI5, within the concept of a session, you have the ability to use any of the xAPI tools. So we would generally recommend using a state document there for doing bookmarking or keeping track of whether or not passed or in a score or any of those things have been sent, et cetera. But you do have access to that. The authorization to that LRS and the endpoint is provided to the assignable unit at launch time via the launch URL. So you should be able to communicate to the LRS directly using xAPI in that way. It would not be erased on completion, at least not automatically. There's no reason why an assignable unit couldn't, for instance, delete a state document during exit, but the LMS itself would not. Let's see.
And we're going to have an example of that in the course examples in the next part of this talk. Perfect.
Thanks, George. Mark asked whether or not we're hosting this deck, and yes, that will be hosted. Does the open source player have a data callback for developer and API keys to integrate with an LMS? It seems like if we do not have a software engineer, that this may be a significant undertaking just to set up and test, especially when the authoring tools aren't there. So the authoring tools issue, I think, is fixed a little bit again by our sample content, which George will be previewing. So there will be CMI5 packages out there in the world that can be used against this player prototype. As far as the APIs to integrate. So I didn't cover that directly. It is in the user guide for the player prototype. The way the player prototype right now works is it has the concept of a tenant. And so there are actually two authorization modes with that player web service. And the first is direct connection between the LMS and the player. So the LMS has an API key and a secret that it can use to do certain actions with that player. And those actions are creating tenants and then getting authorization tokens. And then once the tenant is created, we provide the facility to use an authorization token. It's a JWT. And what that then allows the LMS to do is to provide that token out to someone else to make web service API calls directly to it. So getting kind of down in the weeds, but yes, there are API keys to integrate with the LMS. It does not use LTI, and hopefully that answered the question. If I pull up player API, we can see down here, there are tenant resources for creating a tenant and deleting a tenant. And then there is the authorization resource, which is what we use to get the token. And this is covered in the player user guide. This goes through and it talks about how to do deployment, the API documentation, how to do authorization using the 2 types of authorization, creating tenants, etc. So while I would say it is not probably going to be approachable for someone that isn't a developer, hopefully we've used good practices here that enable the developers to do what they need to do. Let's see, Eric Cross asked about how is security handled to ensure authenticity of requests. Hopefully I just covered that at least with the player. So the player itself is expected to be tightly integrated to the LMS system. So the LMS system, as I mentioned, has a set of credentials that are specific to it. And then again, the authorization to access the player web services themselves is done via tokens.
Brian, I've got one for you.
Sure.
With the upcoming changes around xAPI moving to IEEE, how is that, and I guess becoming version 2.0, how is that going to affect CMI5?
Sure. So CMI5 itself is currently, the current release is directly requires a 1.0 version of xAPI. My understanding of xAPI 2.0 is that there's not significant enough movement to cause any issues for the CMI5 specification. I do believe that we will need to bump a CMI5 release version that at least mentions using xAPI 2.0 as a possibility. But I don't believe that there's anything in the profile right now that shouldn't still just work with either an LRS that implements 1, 2, or both. Let's see. There's a question here about, is there any assumption to have certain predefined API endpoints in the LRS? The only assumption that the player prototype has made here is that the LRS is conformant to the xAPI specification. So as far as having predefined API endpoints, yes, to be conformant with CMI5, the LMS has to work with an LRS that provides all of the xAPI resources themselves. The player prototype should be configurable to work with any external LRS. There is no LRS built into Catapult. So we've seen it work with common LRSs, the Rustici LRS, obviously, Learning Locker. There's some potential issue with the ADL reference LRS, which they are working through to get that fixed. I think Veracity has been tested. So there's a number of LRSs out there in the world that have been used with the Catapult player. So, and then within the LRS, it absolutely would have to implement the statement API and the state documents, and then the agent profile resource, so that the player itself can do all of the functionality that it expects to do.
I've got another one for you, if you'd like.
Sure.
We've been doing the CMI5 thing for a while, but out in the world, there have been people launching xAPI courses for a very long time, or at least what we might call xAPI courses. Why is CMI5 like the direction forward? What's wrong with just using the tin can launch model that we already use?
Right. So yeah, so around here, I'm very particular about this. So I refer to them as the tin can launch guidelines, or even occasionally a package that has a tin can.xml file. What is the problem with that? There's a few problems. The biggest problem, frankly, is the fact that it wasn't community driven. It wasn't intended as this thing that was supposed to last for 10 years. It was just a side document with an early version of xAPI that was kind of a thought on how you might do this with an LMS. So it hasn't been peer reviewed. It's not on a standards track. And honestly, the biggest problem and the biggest departure from it to CMI5 is actually this concept of the information model. That doesn't exist in the tin can launch guidelines. you don't even have to use an LRS with those guidelines. You'll actually get the endpoint and the authorization, but there's nothing that says you have to ever record a statement. You don't have to use xAPI. So that's really what CMI5 is doing here. It's saying, we know that this piece of content has been launched by an LMS. We know that the content itself believes that it's running correctly. And we know certain various other things about it. We know what past means. We know what, we know to expect xAPI statements and those kinds of things. And that's the big reason why it's better. There's a few things around security, authorization, some just best practices as far as the actual structure of the CMI5 content. What's being communicated to the LMS via the metadata is definitely improved in CMI5. Essentially, there was a lot of lessons learned, and the tin can launch guidelines just weren't moving along with the community, with the industry. There's a question here that says, can you explain the role of Apache? There's no actual Apache here. So the web service API is built into the software itself. So this runs as a Node.js app. And so it is running directly. It listens on a particular port that's configurable. And so the only place that a web service or a web server like Apache or Nginx would fit in here is probably to act as a proxy to provide, for instance, SSL or various other, I guess, items as far as making sure that your deployment is secure for your location. But the software itself doesn't require a third-party web server like Apache.
What about the Apache open source license itself? Why did we choose that?
Honestly, that's what ADL has used on most of its previous projects, and that's kind of where we've seen the xAPI project itself, CMI5, the specification, those types of things have been using that license. Let's see, is Catapult on an IEEE standards track? Not to my knowledge, not at the moment. This is all very new. So this is really the first time that we've talked about it extensively out in the wild. Probably what would need to happen is CMI5 itself would need to move to be on an IEEE standards track. And then I would expect the pieces of Catapult, assuming they're successful, would go along with helping CMI5 to be on the IEEE standards track, if my understanding of IEEE is correct. There's another good question from Bob. Is there a way to share learner information between learners as opposed to every learner being, in a sense, in a silo? Not technically. So there is that capability again in xAPI. Generally, we would not expect someone to use it. And the implementation of the player for a given LMS is allowed to restrict authorization to that LRS really in whatever manner it sees fit. So we would actually expect a number of those implementations to restrict the data capture to be about a single actor, and that would be kind of normal in the CMI5 space. So we've come up on our time here, and so I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to have their break. Kind of what we're going to suggest is, if you didn't get your question answered, please stick around for part 2. Listen to what George has to say about the sample pack content and the content testing suite, and then there'll be another QA at the end where you can try and get your question in there, or drop it in the chat, and we will be sure to follow up after this webinar with anybody that has a question that didn't get answered. So I believe we are now starting our 5-minute break. Thank you, everybody.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the second part of this. Instructional designers, this is your time. This is when we're going to see the content testing portion of this experience and some of the content you get to work with itself. I have been wanting to talk about this for months. I'm really excited that we're finally getting to tell people about it. We've been hearing questions to guide people on how does CMI5 content work? What is our, how would we build it? This is the moment where we're really putting something out there that should try to show at least some good practices around that experience. So far, besides hearing about CMI5, you've heard about the LTS verifying that LMSs are behaving. You've heard about an integratable player prototype. It provides a balanced launch experience that we can integrate with other systems. However, I'm going to harp on something that Brian's already said because it's extremely important to us. What we've done with Catapult is this is an end-to-end ecosystem for all things CMI5. In the learning world, when it comes to trying to deliver learning materials, it's a balanced equation. If we don't have content to play, LMSs aren't going to implement new functionality. Without LMSs to play it on, content authoring solutions aren't going to do the effort to get it publishing in the new standards. With Catapult now, we've got tools on both sides of this to encourage vendors to integrate CMI5 in their LMSs, because now there's a meaningful way to test that their solutions are actually correct, or at least match the other solutions in the industry. And for content creators to take advantage of those benefits of the standard, and they can bring their packages to LMS platforms, and they'll behave according to the rules that everybody expects they should behave by. So to go with the LTS, we have Catapult's CMI5 Content Test Suite. This is our solution to standardizing the testing process for content and verifying it for conformance. Y'all love a good architecture diagram, right? We've seen, here's one more. I think this is the last one, and then no more architecture diagrams. This looks a lot like the player prototype diagram. There's two good reasons for that. The same technologies and the same sensibilities that we used in the CTS are what we use for the player prototype. The CTS itself contains a runnable instance of the player prototype as the driver for the content testing experience. This is a great moment in eating our own dog food. It really affirms that the way the player prototype was designed is suited to be built into other applications. As with everything else you've seen today, to run the CTS, you'll still need your xAPI conformant LRS backing the experience. But otherwise, the web service APIs at the CTS and at the player prototype level, they're all part of Catapult itself. Deployment and operational instructions can be found in that GitHub that Brian showed earlier, as well as some of the documentation we'll talk about moving forward. So let's get right into using the CTS. This is great. I am so glad that this is going out into the world today. You know what? I'll even go so far as to get us to log in. So the CTS is a multi-tenanted solution for providing a content testing environment. I will get myself logged in here. I'll definitely want to keep myself signed in. What you're presented with when you first start is whatever courses you have loaded into the system. These are all of your testable CMI5 entities that you're going to be able to, launch and validate repeatedly over the lifetime of that course. So right off the bat, I've already got some preloaded in. Instead, I'm going to show you how to load one in. When you've got a course, you've got the ability to upload a zip package or a raw CMI5 XML. This is very much, if you're from the SCORM world, you remember your SCORM zip files with a manifest. It's the same structured package. It's now just a zip. There, to be precise, we call it a zip 64 package with the CMI5 XML at the root. That's your content structure. In either way, just pressing continue will bring you to a particular loaded course. So I'm going to cheat and I'm going to go right into one that we've already loaded. In this view of a loaded course, you're presented with the basic layout of how the course is composed. You're also presented with any tests that you've already run and the status of them as they currently exist. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to get to what it would look like to start off doing a test. Now, in a little bit, I'm going to be talking about the content. There's no good way to do a test in the CTS without also having content to use in the CTS. So you're going to get a sneak peek a few minutes ahead of time of the actual content. I'm going to blow right through that. Don't worry, we'll come back to looking at the content. So on the CTS itself, you can either manually specify an actor, an example, homepage, and name that might meet your criteria for testing, or the thing that I do the most often, this great randomize button. So you can just get a functional user that you can go right into testing with. And then you get the meat and potatoes screen of setting up and running a test. This gives you all of the major pieces about describing the combination of the elements you're going to test, as well as the learner you're going to test it with. You've got the learner description, you've got the assignable units. As Brian mentioned earlier, there could be 1,000 of these assignable units in here. Since this is the simplest explanation, we're just going to start with a course packaged with a single assignable unit. There's a lot of custom configuration hiding right under here, and we'll get to that in just a minute. For the moment, though, let's go right into the launch process, and we'll work our way back out of these various panels. So when we launch, we're presented with a primary player interface, and we've got our event log that's showing you what is currently being done at the LRS level as we move through this content. So in this case, every time we experience a slide, we're receiving new experience statements showing up in the event log because the CTS itself is proxying to the LRS, and we're capturing all of that experience data on the way through, so we can create a full log of your content playing experience. So I'm going to go ahead and exit before getting any further. And you'll notice one of my favorite things about what we can do with CMI5 now, Brian already spoke to it a little bit, is we've got this return URL. We've actually navigated to a custom page as part of the leaving experience. It's not something you could meaningfully do in SCORM. So now you can, this leads into some great things you can do around frame set versus pop-up behavior. We'll come back to that, keep that in mind. So I'm going to exit the player experience. We've got a lot of things that have now occurred here, but the least of it is that we have not yet received conformance because we didn't do all the things that CMI5 requires in a content package to get conformance, which is that we didn't complete or pass the experience. We did, however, generate a log of what we've done up to this point. And you can see we still, when we go back to this log, we still got a record of everything that we've done in this particular session, including up to that terminated point. We also have the ability to download this log. And while I'm not going to leave the browser window right now to show it, what you'll receive is a JSON file that has a full description of that experience. So this gives you, excuse me, this gives you an artifact that you can take with you and keep with this course that you can hand over whenever anyone is looking for, oh, I'm delivering you this course. Here's proof that it works in the CMI5 Conformance Test Suite via Catapult. So that's great. This is now, you now truly have a way when delivering your content to also meet criteria that the vendor on the other end can independently verify, and everybody is on the same page. So that, from one end to the other, is the very basics of the CTS. It can do an awful lot more, but for the starting point, we're going to show what it looks like when you fail a test, because even more exciting than passing tests is finding out when things aren't conformant and why. These items that we have right here are part of the LMS Test Suite, and an LMS Test Suite isn't just about making sure that the happy path works. It's also making sure that the various ways you can fail are correctly handled during the failure experience. So I'm going to use these ones that are intended to fail in a whole bunch of ways. And I'll start with number one here. When I create a new test around this failure, what you'll see, and I'll go ahead and just launch this right up, we've got all of these great spec violations tucked in here. And this is fantastic because now not only are you dealing with my piece of content didn't work, you now have the specifics of why didn't it work? Why is it that your content is considered to be misbehaving? Now, of course, it does say success true. That is that the LMS, the package itself correctly ran all of its failing components. Because it's designed for a test suite, to be true means that it failed in the ways we expected it to fail. One of the nice things in the CTS is as you mouse over each of these failures, take a look. It tells you exactly what this failure is. And that's a description that gives you a code that you can go back to the specification and you can look up that failure and say, oh, I can map this to a specific reason, and we can try to resolve it based on that knowledge within the spec. There is a full list of those spec requirements hiding right there on that profile button in the CTS that you can filter your way through if you want to look at any particular part of the specification to find out what is the most appropriate reason as to why you received any particular failure. There's a lot of testable components here. So this is a, it's not good reading material to start from scratch, but it is great for when you want to go do your homework and dig into this in greater depth. We also have multiple AU structures. So Brian mentioned that CMI5 requires a minimum of support for at least 1,000 AUs in a package. What this really means is you can have nested structures, you can have multiple AUs, and the CTS shows that in a couple different ways. For one, in this particular package, everything's at the root. So you can see we've got our container of the course, and then all of these CMI5 packages themselves that are structured at the root. When I drill into each one, it gives us all the details about how that package was designed, structured, configured by the content author. So the most interesting ones in the day-to-day use is the URL, the what you're actually going to launch in the content package. The launch method, this is where we talk about pop-ups or frame sets, more to come. What counts as the way you succeed in taking the material? That's called our move-on criteria. The content author specifies that as part of the design. And what's interesting about all of these properties, we've got mastery score and such as well. These are all the content author suggestions. The way the specification works is it technically allows the LMS provider, the LMS administrator, to make changes to that experience based on what they think is appropriate. So when we make a test and we come in here to launch in the assignable units, you'll see that the launch experience is that we have each AU independently launchable. When I go into here, I also have the ability to control any of those things that were part of the core CMI5 structure. I can change it from if they had set a custom mastery score, if they set a pop-up mode, I can change that to a new mode, and that's completely allowed within the specification. So we provide you a model here as for how to take advantage of that when you're doing this work. So when I launch a new window, just to show that off, you'll see now that I've got this new tab here. The primary launcher is still here. And if I do anything in the content, we're still generating statements and capturing data around this experience. When I close this out, then I can close this out. We've also got this little abandon button because the CMI5 standard has a separate concept for exiting correctly and then abandoning content. We give you a way to deal with that, as well as we give you a way to waive an AU. Now, waiving an AU does affect your ability to receive your conformant checkmark, but it represents another way to consider material completed, to consider material able to be passed, moved on from beyond the standard move-on criterias. These things that fiddle with conformance, they're more for just complete usage across a spec. The primary workflow case is that you're going to be launching each one of these items in the CTS, getting your conformant mark, and that will give you a conformance mark for the entire course. If you see here, we get our kind of our high-level view of that, and then our registration log will still be for each AU that we launch, we'll have a record of that experience. So this was a top-level view of what it is we can do with the CTS and what our possibilities are for how you manage the workflow around actually testing content. Now, let's get to the types of things you might be testing. So, excuse me, I'm rather passionate about actually getting content that's standards conformant and testable. It's a topic we spend an awful lot of time around here. Probably more passionate than I should be about it, but it matters because every time we have more testable conformant content, everyone's lives are happier. There's a lot to love about CMI5, especially if you've been coming from the AICC and SCORM worlds. We've already kind of gone over some of those in the QA. There's that real authorization step that comes as part of the CMI5 standard. It's not authentication, it's authorization. That's a whole topic. Come to the CMI5 working group one day and we'll really dive into it if you care. We definitely didn't have that authorization step built into the standard when we did SCORM. CMI5 courseware can be launched from a fully remote environment. So you have your player in one domain, your content can live in a fully separate domain. It actually works. It plays in this strict, very testable manner. AICC had some models for that, but it was a little harder to test. It wasn't as capable as what we're doing here. And SCORM launching remotely, I'm sure many of you are aware of just how challenging that can be. So CMI5 is an awesome way forward. But we all kind of have budgets and other pressing concerns. We're unlikely to get the chance to drop everything and convert our entire corpus of CMI5 in a fit of learning standards passion. Well, would you? Because I would. I'm ready. But this is more of a gradual process. So here's some questions that you can take with you about where are we going and when might be a good time to see if we can start bringing our environment towards CMI5. If you're on content projects right now they're going to be delivered in systems that can launch CMI5 packages, and there's no other blockers or limitations to the systems that you need to work with on the authoring tools or on the LMS side itself, it's a great reason to just consider try to get this thing launched, published and launched CMI5. Once you've done it and once you're comfortable with it, it's a thing that's just as repeatable as any of the other models you already use. With your learners, do you find that you're not able to answer all the questions about how your learners are interacting with their courseware than you would like? CMI5 has a lot of options for that. Look, we all know there's that type of course that you have to understand the corporate policy of why you're not allowed to get rid of the remains of your salmon and your burnt popcorn lunch by shoving it into the paper shredder. You know who you are, a person who caused that course to become policy. But most of us are like building courses with real training and safety information where we actually want a record of important details about how the learner interacted and not just a checkbox that says passed. And while CMI5 gives us that big four set of completion criteria that is standard known as that xAPI profile for CMI5, because it's on top of xAPI with that data model and the transport that is so flexible, you can collect anything you want and then pipe it to your analytics system, get reporting on it. Are you just ready to keep up with the latest and greatest things that all the government agencies are jumping on? DOTI 1322.26 is now a living, breathing document that we have a link to later in this presentation. It's, excuse me, and it now references CMI5 as the way forward for doing course launching. And that is right here on adl.gov. You can read the CMI5 section. This is the updated version of that DOTI, and we're very excited to see it here. And honestly, closest to my heart, just from the day-to-day operations of making learning work everywhere. If you're up to your eyeballs in support requests surrounding pop-ups or not pop-ups or mobile devices or desktop browsers, whatever happens that causes pop-ups or not pop-ups to be okay, you as the content author now have full control of that pop-up experience by default. Sure, LMS admins can do different things in their environments to potentially override that, but you can give your best instructions to them as part of delivering that piece of CMI5 content that you think this content should be deployed as. We're trying to put as much control back in the content authoring tools and content authoring teams as you've ever possibly had. So you're welcome. Let's see, with all of those great things as to why we should move our content forward, we put some course templates together that should show some good practices around what it is to deliver content in CMI5 and some ideas around what we think are great ideas for building it. So let's switch on over to the CTS again and back on out. So we did launch this framed style introduction to geology example. For folks who aren't familiar with CMI5's naming standard, it's all based on the hardness on the Mohs scale. So we're currently at quartz. Topaz, I believe, is next. And we started a little bit too high on the scale because that leaves us only 2 versions to go from Topaz, but we'll figure out something in the meantime. Let's just go ahead and launch this test package and talk about some of the characteristics that we have in here. Okay, in this test package, one of the things that you notice right off is this is done in a more traditional content scaling style. We would not consider this particular style as the most mobile friendly and responsive. I'll show a different template that uses the same structures that do that. This is a style that shows off the more traditional, the window scale, the content scales within the window space as whatever is available for it to fit in changes in size. A lot of content has been authored this way. So we wanted to model showing content off that looks like this, but we're still using new standards to deliver the training. This one is built with that sidebar menu that we all know and love. And as we navigate through, we receive experience statements. I showed that off a moment ago. We're also, in this example content, we've got a lot of neat little things happening under the scenes. Here is a video entity. All of the statements we're generating from this video entity subscribe to the xAPI video profile. So we keep talking about xAPI profiles. The CMI5 is also an xAPI profile. The video profile, which tells us everything about the data we're collecting in xAPI in a very well-structured way, is another one. And you can mix and match them together. So the statements generated from this video, all of these statements that are occurring here, also satisfy the xAPI video profile as well as CMI5 allowed statements. So we're actively encouraging, please use other profiles. So that way reporting from various packages are all consistent with one another. Once you build the model for how you want to report on videos, then all things that deliver video should report in roughly the same way. That would be a huge step forward for taking advantage of all that additional xAPI data and using CMI5 as the wrappings around that experience. Navigating through all of this content, you'll notice we continue to generate experience data. You'll also notice that in all of this geology content, it's got a lot of the same, excuse me, it's got a lot of the same styles and structures that you use in current deliverable e-learning. So we're not going crazy on the design here. We're just showing the CMI5 mechanics behind this. And most importantly, get to the quiz, we're going to show the ability to generate reasonable interactions. These follow the xAPI SCORM profile interactions. So they'll look very familiar to folks who have built SCORM courses in the past. The interactions are still interactions. And by default, I'm going to press this button here because it'll give us another chance to look at failed conformance. So we've got one button that fills everything out and lets you test it. Well, I didn't do great. I'm embarrassed for myself. But we'll close out. It leaves us, because failure isn't a conformance error. Failure is a completely normal thing to happen as part of the student's experience. We can come back and launch it again. You'll notice we have bookmarking support. So we talked just a moment earlier about activity state data and how you would use that to represent what used to be called the SCORM suspend data. We have an example of that as part of this course template. So you can look in there and see, how do you write an activity state document? How do you keep that document up to date? And then how do you read from it when you need to? I'll hit resume from bookmark, and that brings us right back into the quiz. So this time I'll select the correct answers. For those of you who remember the golf course, I bet all of you really wish you had this button right here every time you were doing your testing on your platforms. I am so excited we get to include these in the templates. So we submit, we got our final score. You can see here, we've got our passed, we've got our completed, we've got all of our interactions that we've made. When we exit the course now, for one, we get that lovely return URL behavior again. And we've got our conformant checkmark. So that gives us, so now we're collecting data with these templates in a couple different profiles. We are collecting interactions, so you can see the types of questions and xAPI data you can generate. And we're doing bid for stuff, time, status, completion, all of those sorts of things. So now I'm going to show you this exact same working structure done in a different design model. So we'll go into the responsive style version. So there's a different UI being presented here. Again, I'll show the scaling of that experience. It's much more mobile friendly when we do this experience here. And this is what we consider a more modern template. It's using the exact same libraries to drive the course player experience, as well as all of the CMI5 interactions. So the internal library that you would use to model your data, the front end doesn't matter. We made sure to show off how you can have completely different front ends, but still collect your CMI5 data the same way. You'll notice that all the content we're presenting here is the same content experience. We've still got our amazingly great answer all the questions correctly at once button. And we still get all of the same completion past experience data that we would expect to get as part of this. So I hit exit here and we close. We've got our great conformant check mark showing we did a great job on this responsive style courseware. Okay, we've already looked at the multi-AU structure, so I'm going to jump ahead to showing the pre-post structure. CMI5, if we look at the course structure here, this shows how you might lay out a CMI5 course so that you could have nested blocks containing higher level concepts within this data. In each one, we've got a pretest, content, post-test. CMI5 itself does not support sequencing in the way that SCORM 2004 supported sequencing. These bits here are organized in that way, but they do not make dependency on one another. So just be aware, there are extensions to the CMI5 standards that as people implement LMSs over time, will find, if you find that there's needs, one, come to the working group, talk about your needs. Two, encourage your LMS vendors to integrate CMI5 extensions. If there's enough power, if there's enough emphasis on particular extensions, there's a better chance that newer versions of the standard will include those extensions. So again, we'll get to the testing view. In the testing view, we actually show the structure of where everything is underneath the main title. So that way you can tell pretest apart from pretest 2. But the launch and testing experience is the same thing as it was all along. We're still presented with the courses. They're still organized in the same way. This is, your LMS will choose to display this in whatever is appropriate, but from a testable perspective, it works exactly the same way. And so I'm going to exit out of here. We close this. And that gave you can see we've got our conformant marks for various elements along this. And the downloadable report still gives you all the same results, no matter how the content is structured. So we've talked for a while now about a lot of the pieces that we've assembled. We didn't quite have time to get into the HTML and JavaScript of various things or how these components are built. Again, we'd love to talk about this stuff. Please come talk to us about it. That's just the tip of the iceberg with Catapult. There is mounds of written literature about every aspect of CMI. You've got documentation on how to install and run them. Brian's showed off some of it. There's more for the CTS. There's more referenced in the resources. For those content packages, there's documents describing how you can load them into an existing LMS, how they're structured, and how you can use the pieces to guide your own custom content development player. It's all there. But on top of all this, there's an absolutely incredible resource called our Best Practices Guide. This was a Herculean effort of a tome, and it was spearheaded by our own Alicia Pack. Thank you, Alicia, so much. This covers pretty much everything you can think about as CMI5, from acquisition guidance on how to get content in LMSs, for project managers trying to deal with adding CMI5 into your workflow, the best ways to maximize the capabilities of CMI5 in your content. I don't care what role you're in, I do strongly encourage you, open this guide, find the section in here that applies to you and your role. Just give it a quick read over. It's broken up into sections that are roughly role focused. So it should be pretty easy to find out what you think should apply to your needs. So we've already said it twice. I'm going to say it one more time. Please help us accelerate CMI5 adoption. Here's a bucket full of tools. Here's books that you can read about exactly how to make all this work. All of you out there who are building learning and building LMSs are the most important people in this story. Let's look at your current workflow, look at your activities, evaluate how you can make CMI5 an integral part of that. Talk about it wherever people are going to listen, internally, externally, with your leaders, your platform vendors, everywhere, all fronts. Learning standards adoption it's like a snowball down a mountain. Every time you push it a little bit, every time it gets rolling, it picks up some steam. It adds more snow, and it gets bigger and bigger. The more mass, the more speed you get, the more mass and more speed and the more adoption you're going to get. Once you're operating in CMI5, you're opening a lot of other doors for learning system ecosystem improvements. You'll be able to capture more around your learner experience. You'll be positioned to get as much as you can think of to pull out. However clever you can be, CMI5 as your container and launch experience and profile, plus xAPI backing it with the xAPI profiles to help you model your data, your cleverness will allow you to just go that much further. Whatever you can think of, there's going to be a way to model it. So I've been talking all along about there's links to things. Here you go. Here's even more links to things. Catapult's a living project. Please come contribute. So there's multiple places where new news about Catapult will come out. If you want to get into CMI5 reading, because there's all sorts of things on all sides of the CMI5 ecosystem to learn about, just take a break from the best practices guide for 5 minutes, and you can follow these links here and learn about CMI5 in slightly more bite-sized chunks. I said, get involved as a community. The Catapult GitHub repo is open to issues and PRs. The CMI5 working group meets weekly. Currently, it's Fridays at 10:30 Eastern. We love newcomers. If you have ideas, you want to help with writing and editing, or you just want to listen in and see how we take a bunch of crazy ideas and wrangle them into a consistent, usable standard, we're open to any and all comers. And last but not least, if you're attending DevLearn or IT6 conferences this fall, please come listen to one or more of our CMI5 sessions. The DevLearn session with myself and Chris Tompkins, all about how SCORM and xAPI can come together under the CMI5 umbrella. And at IT6, I believe Brian and Andy will be delivering that Bridging the SCORM and xAPI Gap talk. So we'd love to hear more from you at any of those. So thank you all for your time. We always say it, we mean it. Ask us anything, start right now. Put your questions in the chat. I have been seeing stuff scrolling in the chat, so I'm looking forward to it. And let me look over here and see what we've got to answer.
Now, let me interject just for a second so you can catch your breath, George. I tried to answer a few of the questions in the chat. One of the things that definitely came up that I want to point out is the fact that these tools are intended to be used by end users. We're expecting organizations, particularly LMS vendors, to leverage the tools via continuous integration, via their own deployments. But the CTS in particular is designed to be usable from a desktop. To do that, we leverage Docker. It's a containerization framework. All the pieces that you need outside of an LRS itself. You will have to bring your own LRS. You have to bring your own credentials to that LRS. But everything else is self-contained to a Docker compose file that should make it easy to stand up the CTS very quickly on an isolated system. So you can get, testing either George's content examples packages or your own CMI5 content, right now. So if you're familiar with Docker, for sure you should try it out. If you're not familiar with Docker, probably something you may want to be looking into. It's pretty straightforward to run as an end user, and we've tried to make it as simple as possible with that compose file. Like I said, you need an LRS, you need the endpoint and some credentials, and that's all you really need.
Great, thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
So we had one that came in right before we switched presenters from Thomas. How will LMS reporting improve with CMI5? Also, Thomas is one of our regular work group attendees, so thanks, Thomas. With LMS reporting has been a kind of mixed bag when it came to xAPI all along, because minus the SCORM xAPI profile, which should not come into play right when xAPI was first formed, everybody was kind of guessing what is the data we should be reporting on that will be consistent across various courses. Eventually, a de facto standard kind of formed as authoring tools met in the middle, and the thing that the xAPI SCORM profile kind of came to all centralized. CMI5 makes that official. It's not just the hopefully all these content authoring tools use this one profile. They say this is the launch profile that gives you the big four and some of the additional data around that. So once you have all of those high level concepts, success status, completion status, score, and time as everybody does it the same way, LMS reporting gets a lot easier for the high-level stuff. Since we're encouraging CMI5 profiles, we're also encouraging other profiles, xAPI video and such, as that is one of those rising tides raises all ships. The more profiles we get out there, the more likely LMSs are going to be able to use them for more reporting. All right. We've got from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, Shatan. Assignable units are defined in cmi5.xml. Can these be nested? And Brian and Duncan, oh, actually, you, Brian and Duncan, you've done a great job. The AUs aren't nestable, blocks are nestable. So blocks are containers that aren't launchable, just like when in SCORM, in the activity tree, there was the container activities and then the launchable SCOs. And a SCO can never contain a SCO, an AU can never contain an AU. It's always contained in the block is the container, the AU is the launchable component. All right.
There was a question about whether or not there's an API wrapper, referring to one that we created for SCORM packages. So you might just cover cmi5.js real quick, George. Sure.
So if I'm lucky, I might be able to even show this, but in the meantime, while I'm talking, the content template packages are structured as a multi-layered thing, so we could keep some functionality separate from each other. At the deepest level, each content package is using a library called cmi5.js. It's linked in the README for the content examples, so you can just follow that. It'll take you right to the library. And that is a raw CMI5 communications library only. It has no knowledge of how courses are structured, organized, or operate. It strictly simplifies the process of taking the steps through a CMI5 course. Your initialize, you're getting the fetch, sorry, I did it in the wrong order, doing the fetch that is required for the LMS to get a launchable experience, doing the initialize, collecting past, completed, and whatever other CMI5 allowed statements you want, and then correctly terminating the experience. It manages a lot of that process for you. On top of that CMI5.js in the course examples, there's a piece of glue that we call our course CMI5.js, which takes the way the course operates. So you think about the UI of the course, there's a layer that runs the UI of the course in JavaScript. Then there's a piece between those two things, which translates, here's how the course is displaying and managing the questions that are presented to the learner and turning them into CMI5 conformant calls. So each of those layers, while it is not specifically like a standalone wrapper that you would be able to truly pluck out and just drop blindly into your experience, models out a lot of the same steps you would take. CMI5.js, the bottommost piece is that GitHub repo, that library, you can pull it straight from NPM, and that will be your building blocks. And then what we show in the course examples will show you ways that you might integrate CMI5.js into your own content experiences. All right. Let's see. Shatan again asks, where can I find the setup steps for the CTS test app? And Brian, I think you know that even better than I do.
Yeah, so the CTS, the best way to deploy it or to run it on your desktop is again with the Docker. So there's within the repository itself, there is a Docker compose file. That's really the best way to go.
Great.
There is another question is, could you briefly explain xAPI profiles and how it's enhancing xAPI? I wasn't able to relate it to CMI5, so you want to go ahead and do that one, George?
I do, but really quick, Martin, did you have a question? I see your raised hand.
Yeah, so my question is, I'm in the xAPI cohort that Torrance Learning is running, and I've been thinking about doing sort of a CMI5 project type thing with that. And do you think this is something feasible to sort of say, like, set it up as a, like, get an LRS, set up CMI5 on it? Like, is there any advice that you have that something that could be doable in that course? or get support to do something in that course to try and learn more about CMI5 as part of this.
Is there a particular goal that you have for the cohort, or is it kind of more open-ended? It's been a long time since I did one of those.
Yeah, my for me, my goal, like I have an ultimate goal for my own stuff, is to, sort of create, in the last round, I created a statement provider, or not I, but we did as a group, using xAPI. And so now it's like, could we do like a course creator that packages together a CMI5 course that has like a AU or 2 or something? Is that something that could get support through, by asking questions, by doing all of that? Is it something that's probably too much to try and consider for that, or?
I think that entirely depends on what your timeline, what your interest level and budget are. We just mentioned the cmi5.js library. It's a really straightforward way. If you have any coding skill at all, it's in JavaScript. It's really a straightforward way to get going. To get an assignable unit spun up. Again, looking at the content examples in the Catapult repository should allow you to get a CMI5 session going very quickly. And then probably the most interesting thing there would be either running the player or running the content test suite and seeing if you can maybe do your own CMI5 AU. Either leveraging the library itself, or if you really want to understand the spec, the best thing to do is to understand those steps that are necessary to get an assignable unit going. When you have an assignable unit running, and then you can see, all of the information coming back to that assignable unit from the LMS, and that allows you to see all the knobs that you can turn. George reviewed them a little bit in the CTS, where you have, what's the launch window, what the mastery score is, what are the move-on criteria, those types of things. Really come out when you understand the spec at that level.
Okay, no, that's helpful. And can I reach out to people there? Like if we have a group and we need to have some questions or anything like that, we could reach out to you, because you said you're trying to get other people to get going.
You can drop us a line at support at Rustici Software. You can join the working group calls. We're happy to have those discussions there. That will be a very dedicated CMI5 resource.
Okay.
Those are probably the best resources that I can think of.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right, and now back to that question about how are xAPI profiles enhancing xAPI. xAPI profiles on the topmost level are just a way for you to say, this is a structured in a very particular way xAPI statement. So xAPI statements, actor, verb, object, and some rules around what all those things are allowed to contain. With profiles, you can add a lot more rules. You can say that a result is required for a video completed statement. So there'll always be a result that has a particular score or a particular duration stored along with it. The profile narrows down what is allowed for a set of xAPI statements, and it also provides, and this is wording that people will be very, it's imprecise, but gets you along the right direction. It's a workflow. It can tell you this thing has to happen before this thing, and any one of these things can happen between these two things. CMI5 is a great example of that. You have to have an initialized, you have to have it terminated, and then whatever happens in the CMI5 session statement-wise happens between those two statements. So the xAPI profile, when it comes to CMI5, is that CMI5, there's a launch piece that gets the course loaded and bootstrapped, and then there's a tracking piece that brackets and describes you have to do it in this order, and you have to have these parts to the CMI5 statement. Otherwise, we don't recognize it as a CMI5 allowed statement. Okay. It looks like we're at 3:30. Are there any other questions that we need to pick up, or are we at time?
I think we're probably at time. There was one that just came in from Raphael. I think we're going to capture that via the chat, and we will try to follow up. Elizabeth?
All right. Well, thank you both so much, and thank you for everyone for logging in and asking so many great questions. I have two things to plug really quick for the ADL initiative. First thing is that if you didn't get a chance to see all of the wonderful presentations, including some from you guys at iFest, that content will be available through October 1st. And in case you're not familiar, there was also this award-winning poster for Best Narrative. They won People's Choice Award for the evolution of e-learning standards, moving from SCORM to xAPI. Where does cmi5 fit? So if you want to see that, you can go on to adlifest.org and register and join there. And then the second thing is that we will have another webinar happening. So that's it from me. And I think thank you so much for everybody for joining. I think that is it for us today.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.